we might get going. Welcome to the second event in the speaker series, Gender, Writing and the Natural World. Thank you all for coming, especially those of you who are here in person and you've come despite this rainstorm that's descended upon us, one of many been here for the last few weeks. I acknowledge that we're meeting on the country of the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians of the lands and waters of the Adelaide region. I acknowledge their deep and abiding connection to country and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I acknowledge First Nations people who are here with us. And for those of you joining us online, I hope you might take a moment to acknowledge the country that you're on. My name is Jess White. I'm a senior lecturer in creative writing and literature at UniSA Creative. I've curated this speaker series, which is funded by UniSA's Creative People, Products and Places Research Centre and by the Copyright Agency, because I'm interested in exploring ways of representing the natural world in Australia. As I mentioned in the introduction to the first event, which we did a couple of weeks ago, I don't think that conventional ways of writing about nature, which were developed in Britain and America, apply to Australia. So by commissioning these writers to speak about their work, I'm trying to work out how writers in Australia, particularly female and non-binary writers, engage with their environments. In our first event, we had readings from 3 poets, Eileen Chong, Natalie Harkin, and Bronwyn Lavelle, and listened to the way the natural world emerged in their words. And this evening, I'm delighted to host Jennifer Mills, a wonderful local author, whose work I find intellectually engaging and endlessly original. But just a little bit of housekeeping before I continue. This event is being recorded, so for any of you here in the room, if you're uncertain about that, please talk to the event staff. For those of you out in the ether, if you are seeing us as a tiny box on your screen, you can adjust your settings to make us bigger. You can pin us to the screen so that we're bigger. And I mention this because my parents once gave up on listening to a presentation I was giving because the box was too small. So there may be other people out there who are not familiar with Zoom, and I feel for you, and for others who are technologically challenged, because it just feels like another thing we have to deal with in the 21st century. Also, for those on Zoom, we have a chat function. So if you have any questions, please pop them in the chat box and we'll read them out at the end of Jen's presentation. As I mentioned, this project is supported by the Copyright Agency, a not-for-profit organisation which plays a critical role in Australia's creativity. It upholds the rights of creators and ensures fair payment. And without payment, artists and writers can't afford to make their work. So I'm especially pleased to welcome Jen, given this context, because Jen has long advocated for adequate payments to writers. And last week, she hosted an event with my UniSA creative colleague, Sam Whiting, on artists and unionising as part of the Reset Arts and Culture series, which is another initiative aligned with CP3. And I mention this, and I will get onto the natural world in a second, I promise, but I mention this because the federal government is developing a new cultural policy for the decade ahead. They're inviting submissions from anyone involved in or interested in our nation's arts, entertainment and cultural sector. The submissions close this Monday, 22nd of August. If you'd like to see more support for the arts in the years ahead, I urge you to put together a submission and send it off. And Jen has also written a brilliant submission. So if you need inspiration or guidance, you can jump to her website and read that. So I'd like to properly introduce Jen to you all and give you some context for her work. Jen is the author of the novels The Airways, Dyschronia, Gone, and The Diamond Anchor, and a collection of short stories, The Rest is Wait. In 2019, Dyschronia was shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Literary Award, Australia's most prestigious prize for literary fiction, and for the Adelaide Festival Awards for Literature and the Aurealis Awards for Science Fiction. The Rest Is Weight was shortlisted for the 2013 Queensland Literary Awards Steel Rudd Award for an Australian short story collection, and longlisted for the 2013 Frank O'Connor International Short Story Award. In 2012, Jen was named a Sydney Morning Herald Best Young Australian Novelist, and in 2014, she received the Barbara Hanrahan Fellowship from the Adelaide Festival Awards for Literature. Jen's fiction, essays, and criticism have been widely published in literary magazines and newspapers, and she was fiction editor for Overland Literary Journal from 2012 to 2018. And this year, Jen is artist in residence at Vital Statistics, which is based at Port River, Yotabilti, at the heritage-listed Waterside Workers Hall. Vital Statistics champions Australian artists who are creating transformative, multidisciplinary art and progressive public dialogue. So I first properly engaged with Jen's work when I was writing an essay on her novel Dyschronia in the context of climate change fiction, and I was impressed with its intricate patterning. It's a novel that can take a while to piece together, and I liked that about it. I liked that it hurt my brain and that I had to apply myself to understand what was happening, because that is what climate change is doing. It's forcing us to grapple with new and unsettling weather patterns, with anxiety, and with the need for many of us to refashion our relationships with ecosystems. And these things take work. And I think writing that helps us to engage with and think about that work is important for helping us to understand a changing world. So I'm delighted to welcome Jen to speak this evening on the subject of unnatural being. Jen will speak for about 40 minutes and then we'll have questions at the end. So please join me in welcoming one of Australia's most innovative contemporary novelists. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Jess, for that really generous introduction, and thanks everyone for coming out in spite of the inclement weather. I also would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking on Kaurna country, not far from the banks of Garawirapari, the river that gives this city its shape, that's flowing fast right now with all this rain. And I want to acknowledge the Kaurna people whose sovereignty was never ceded, acknowledge Kaurna elders past and present, and the work, the labour of all those who've cared for this land and its stories before us. So my name's Jennifer Mills and I'm an unnatural being. That means that when I was invited to speak on the subject of gender and nature, the overlap between these two terms made me initially quite nervous. It's in my nature to be uncomfortable with the very idea of nature, the distinctions the term creates between acceptable and unacceptable behaviours and desires, the value systems it imposes and disguises. For me, nature and gender are both trouble. Whether or not I address this directly, my writing about the natural world is always occurring within that trouble, a difficult, often damaging relationship between gender and nature. I exist in a culture where gender norms, gender binary, and essentialist feminisms, political agendas, and religious beliefs have sought to exclude people like me from the idea of the natural. And there's always a discomfort with the structures at play, even before I'm fully aware of those structures. So gender and nature aren't terms that I can use easily or lightly, but maybe the unease and the feeling of looking askance or looking over one's shoulder at nature is interesting in itself. I recently went hiking for 5 days along the first few sections of the Hyson Trail. It's been repackaged as a destination hike called the Wild South Coast Way. And there are fancy new campgrounds dotted along it, artfully posed in pleasing locations. It's a really, really beautiful, beautiful walk. Walking through the bush, my friends and I were jokingly complimenting the landscape's designer. A gardener could not have arranged the grass trees and correas more beautifully than they'd arranged themselves. But then in the brand new campsites, that pleasantness became questionable. We were much more aware of the human agents behind the scenes. Someone had built these tent pads with a view. Someone had made unnecessarily meandering curved paths into camp because they liked how it looked on their CAD, framing and delivering this staged wilderness experience to their liking and for our benefit, although we could have done without the winding paths at the end of a 20-kilometre day, I can tell you. It was really interesting to notice how this relationship between nature and what is visually aesthetically appealing is already very culturally specific, organising our enjoyment of a so-called wild place and turning it into a landscape. How we see and experience landscape, nature, the wild, and we often use these terms casually and interchangeably, is often directly cultivated in this way. But so, of course, is the land itself, everywhere changed and organised by human work. In The Biggest Estate on Earth, Bill Gammage showed that this continent was a cultivated landscape well before 1788. And Bruce Pascoe extended our understanding of land management in Dark Emu, arguing that every landscape on this continent has been marked and changed by a complex of practices that are best thought of as agriculture. In her essay, The European Construction of Wilderness, Marcia Langton pointed out that the valorization of wilderness is a form of amnesia that erases Indigenous people, an extension in Australia of terra nullius. To call a place a wilderness is to seek to erase the Indigenous knowledge and history and labour that has shaped and continues to shape our environment. As a result, conservation movements have often historically been in conflict with movements for Aboriginal self-determination and land rights. I hope this is becoming less true, but that essay was written in the 1990s and it's very hard-hitting and it's kind of startling to realise how much of it is still true. The impossibility of the idea of wilderness becomes even more apparent when we look at the effects of global shifts in climate and weather. The climate crisis has, or should have, erased any illusions we might have had about the purity of nature or its infinite free gifts or our own separation from it. Microplastics have now been found in fresh Antarctic snow. All rainwater on Earth contains harmful per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances or PFAS chemicals from manufacturing. Bushfire reaches ecosystems that have not evolved alongside it, including the Gondwana rainforest, home to nightcap oaks, a species that has survived for tens of millions of years but was severely damaged by fire in 2019. Nowhere is there a pristine wilderness. But then that idea was always an illusion, convenient to empires that sought to occupy and extract. Even the way some conservation movements talk about nature encloses it in a resource mentality still. Ideas like ecosystem services attempt to justify the preservation of our environment, but also make nature subservient to capital. Last week, I was reading an article in the ABC about cuttlefish returning to the waters off Whyalla. And it described this as a boon for Spencer Gulf tourism operators. We really struggle to conceive of the importance of the natural world outside our own limited systems of measuring market value. If we pause to observe the myriad ways in which human beings are destroying our own habitat, that destructiveness is so widespread that it can start to seem natural too, an animal impulse, inescapable. Using myths like the tragedy of the commons, capital has taught us that competitive resource extraction is human nature. But there's nothing natural about it. It's a historical reality, born of circumstances we changed and can now choose to change again. There is nothing unnatural about it, is something that Oscar Wilde said of homosexual desire. And he was right. If we look outside our own species, there are homosexual tendencies, relationships, behaviours and histories well documented in more than 450 species, from bonobos to dragonflies. Books such as Bruce Bagger Mills' Biological Exuberance, Animal Homosexuality and Natural Diversity, and Joan Roughgarden's Evolution's Rainbow provide an overview and emphasise the various roles that sexuality can play outside of reproduction, maintaining social cohesion, building power, gaining or sharing pleasure, and so on. During the difficult push for marriage equality a few years ago, I began to see memes about this everywhere. Lists of species that might justify our human desires based on their occurrence in the natural world. I came to think of these as gay penguin arguments after the famous New York couple Roy and Silo. Roy and Silo were two chin-strap penguins who got together in Central Park Zoo in 1998. When zookeepers noticed the pair were exhibiting incubating behaviors and trying to steal eggs from other penguins, they gave them an egg-shaped rock and watched them for a little while. And pretty soon after that, they gave them a real egg, a spare that needed fostering. And Roy and Silo raised a chick who was named Tango. There's a children's book about this penguin family, and Tango Makes Three, written by Peter Parnell and Justin Richardson and illustrated by Henry Cole. The book became a bestseller, but it's also regularly been listed as one of the top 10 most banned books in public libraries and schools across the United States. It's absurdly contentious given that it's about penguins. Gay penguin arguments don't really convince us, partly because arguments about sexuality are never really arguments about nature, but always about culture. Animal nature is too diverse and strange to be anything like what we think of as natural. You only have to YouTube one octopus sex video to understand how weird are the varieties of natural reproduction on Earth, how useless it is to try to describe anything in that infinite diversity as normal. Don't say I didn't warn you. Cuttlefish flirt with their light-emitting skin. Some reptiles, like the North American whiptail lizard, are all female species that reproduce through parthenogenesis. There are more than 500 species of fish that are known to change their sex in adulthood, including the sequentially hermaphroditic clownfish. Banana slugs grow penises the size of their entire bodies, so large that they sometimes get stuck inside their mate's body, and when this happens, the mate simply eats them. And that's before you even ask about non-human sexual cultures or think beyond reproductive function. Nature is weird. And yeah, Nemo is trans. Just as nature itself is always altered by human influence, our arguments about what is natural and unnatural are always really about cultural norms. Like the beautiful, the natural is a measure of its times. Nature has done a lot of work, underwriting gender norms, racism, eugenics, homophobia, transphobia, ableism. It's a word that seeks to impose permanency and order on power structures that are contingent, temporary, and political. One rather dystopian illustration of this is happening in the United States right now, where the movement to set reproductive rights back half a century has been joined by wellness influencers who are now proclaiming that contraception is unnatural. Tango, a female penguin, went on to pair with another female penguin and raise young for several consecutive seasons. It's interesting to note that the cultural legitimacy of gay penguins is based almost entirely on their ability to successfully raise chicks, as if gay penguins must act like straight penguins in order to be fully penguin. For many, sexuality remains aligned with reproductive purpose, and human interpretations of nature serve human agendas. So nature's a word that's often weaponized against us. It's a word that tries to claim belief as fact. It's hard to think your way outside your own culture. And as a result, we're mostly capable of seeing what we're already looking for. I'm with Donna Haraway on this one. Science has never been good at seeing outside its stories. As a writer, I've always been very interested in the way that narratives structure our thought, in the phenomena of confabulation and self-delusion. In the face of an avalanche of evidence, it's still difficult to convince some people that the climate crisis is real or that it requires systemic change. Patterns of seeing what we're already looking for are often stronger than facts. These patterns of seeing are really what I'm thinking about when I'm writing about the climate crisis. There are deep underlying narratives or myths about who we are and what we're for, what the earth is and what it's for, that are holding us in place, that are literally driving us off a cliff. Writing about nature, I'm concerned mainly with cultural problems, social narratives, and issues of value and power and agency. 5 years ago, I wrote in an essay about art and landscape that at 1 degree of warming, a catastrophic bushfire is still what we call a natural disaster. I remembered this a few weeks ago because I was reading an opinion piece by former Fire Chief Greg Mullins, who's been very vocal about the climate emergency. Writing in The Guardian, Mullins made the following observation. We often hear politicians refer to natural disasters. There's nothing natural about what we're going through now. And perhaps it's time for us to instead be calling them unnatural disasters. I was very struck by that term and what it might mean for our patterns of seeing, our narratives about the climate crisis. If nature itself is becoming unnatural, what does that mean for us? I was born at 333 parts per million atmospheric carbon dioxide. According to NASA's Global Land Ocean Temperature Index, the last year that Earth had a lower than average temperature was 1976, the year before I arrived. Australia's fire season is now 1 full month longer than it was then. I learned about the greenhouse effect in primary school. It was very urgent then, and a neat catastrophist segue for me from childhood terror of nuclear war. I've never known a natural world that wasn't in the process of being damaged by human extraction, human greed, or human conflict. When I was 11, author and activist Bill McKibben published a book called The End of Nature, in which he claimed that we live in a post-natural world. I didn't read it when I was 11, by the way, I wasn't that smart. McKibben argued that we could no longer rely on nature's permanency, on the constancy of the seasons, or the existence of wilderness. We were losing, and I quote, the separate and wild province, the world apart from man, to which he adapted, under whose rules he was born and died. But if we listened to Marsha Langton, we would know that wilderness was never a world apart. It's always been a way of seeing that privileges a certain agenda, a colonial agenda often. Wilderness is a power relationship, not a place. It's tempting to conclude that there's nothing natural about nature anymore, that there never has been, that because everything's cultivated, touched, or altered, then all is lost. Val Plumwood called this idea nature skepticism. In her essay, The Concept of a Cultural Landscape, Plumwood argued that nature skepticism is rightly difficult to untangle from post-colonial approaches to nature. While the idea of the cultural landscape seeks to redress the erasure Langton and others have identified, it also privileges human agency over the non-human agency of other species and actors, animals, mountains, natural systems. And here it's worth noting that Plumwood's position that consciousness is not a precondition of agency is extended in Bruno Latour's work in his more recent revival of the Gaia hypothesis. Plumwood says that the idea of the end of nature generates a difficulty of speaking that weakens the political legitimacy of the concept. If we're not sure whether what we're speaking about is real, how do we protect or care for or respect the needs of the non-human world? As fires, floods, and heat waves appear with increasing frequency, these unnatural disasters overlapping before our eyes, it's becoming more difficult to deny the Earth's agency. In the Anthropocene, this planet behaves as an active force of mythical dimensions. In his influential book, The Great Derangement, Amitav Ghosh wrote that literature was struggling to depict the events of the climate emergency. Climate change events are peculiarly resistant to the customary frames that literature has applied to nature. They are too powerful, too grotesque, too dangerous, and too accusatory to be written about in a lyrical or elegiac or romantic vein. Indeed, in that these events are not entirely of nature, whatever that might be, they confound the very idea of nature writing or ecological writing They are instances rather of the uncanny intimacy of our relationship with the non-human. Now, I disagree with Gosh on a few things, but let's stay with that term uncanny intimacy for a moment. In my novel Dyschronia, about the first thing that happens is that the sea abruptly and mysteriously retreats, leaving an enormous tide line of rotting corpses along the shore of the fictional town of Clapston. I didn't say it was a pleasant beach read. The image came to me subconsciously, I guess, influenced by the shallows and smells of the Upper Spencer Gulf and surrounds, the landscape that had infiltrated my imagination even before I moved from Arrernte to Ngurrtjeri country in 2011. Influenced too by a growing awareness of the rapidity and urgency of the climate crisis and the challenge of finding ways to depict nature as it was unraveling. I wasn't consciously looking for a way to make the climate crisis imaginable, let alone lyrical, but I was interested in the image itself. It was an imaginative flip. We all knew sea levels were rising, so reversing that seemed to generate something that referred to the crisis, but was still surprising, even shocking. And at first, I was interested in the image mostly because of its shocking quality. But as I kept circling back to it and admitting it was a novel, I realized I was more interested in that revealed shore than in the water. The shame, the inability to look away, the inescapable smell that gets in your mouth and nose and house. It has an uncanny intimacy. So much is being done to our oceans through global heating and acidification and shifting wind patterns that we can't see or that we can choose not to see. I read news reports of 90% plankton loss in the Atlantic that can be clicked through and forgotten or chalked up to the now daily lists of catastrophic signs and warnings. Tasmania's lost 95% of its kelp forests in a few short decades, and we don't have to watch it happen. So I was interested in that particular image as prophecy, interested in the way the sea threatened to expose the damage that lay beneath its surface, a revelation of hidden consequences. Bell Hooks spoke about queerness as something beyond the dimension of who you happen to be attracted to. She describes queer as being about the self that is at odds with everything around it and has to invent and create and find a place to speak and to thrive and to live. The imagination is called forth in the reconstructing and re-envisioning of self and possibility. When queerness is considered a disorder, as it has been for most of my life and in many places and contexts still is, the queer experience becomes one of being at odds with, of existing in spite of the order of the world, and thus of having to create or remember other kinds of order, forms of social organization, family, and coexistence that might make your existence possible. There's a flourishing of creativity and diversity in there, of survival and salvage and reciprocity, building community across difference. There's also an affinity with other outsiders, including aliens and monsters and the non-human world. It's hard to think your way outside your own culture, but an experience of queerness, of being odd and strange and outside the natural order, can also have benefits. It gives you ways of seeing differently at an angle to the patterns of seeing that your culture takes for granted. So being queer has given me a skepticism about cultural norms, which is quite useful in other contexts, including creatively. Now, I don't mean to claim that this experience is exclusive to gender non-conforming non-heterosexuals. There are lots of ways of being pushed outside your cultural comfort zone or learning to see through its illusions about itself. But for me, in my writing and the development of my voice, the queer has always offered a critical point of view. It's contributed to my sense of distance, even exile from the culture I'm in. And it's enhanced my sense of my own capacity to change it. So queer to me is not just an identity. A queer position doesn't strive to be welcomed into the mainstream's idea of normal variation. Instead, it's a declaration that there is no normal. Queer politics offers a set of strategies for living and thriving in a world which is trying to impose limitations and rules. It offers a way of opening portals to better or more survivable worlds. I think that's where my interest in the power of the uncanny really comes from my own experience of being an unnatural being. However, the uncanny is already very present in Australian literature. Horror or apocalypse or estrangement are in so many of our stories. You could be forgiven for thinking that the weird is where settler Australia makes most sense to itself. Even the idea of Australia, the invention of Australia, coincides with a specific kind of weirdness, the colonial weird, the colonial uncanny. The first royal visit ever made to Australia was by Prince Alfred in 1867 and 68, the second son of Victoria and Albert. He was in his early 20s at the time. And when he went to Tasmania, someone gave the young prince a wombat, which travelled home with him on board his ship. Later, that same wombat, I believe, somehow ended up in a secondhand exotic animal shop in London, where he was purchased by artist Dante Gabriel Rossetti. This wombat named Top was so loved by Rossetti that there are several illustrations of him, including this one where the artist is weeping copiously into a handkerchief over the wombat's dead body. Top didn't live very long. As settlers attempted to familiarize themselves with unfamiliar landscapes and species, a sense of appreciation for the perceived weirdness of Australia was married young to a very acquisitive colonial exoticism. Alastair Patton's book of Marsupials and Men describes a roaring trade in animals back and forth from Europe throughout Australia's early years, with removal of animals such as Kangaroo Island's dwarf emus to join menageries in France directly contributing to their extinction. Winston Churchill was so taken with Australian wildlife that in 1943, with war raging across Europe, he telegrammed then Australian Prime Minister John Curtin to request 6 platypuses. In hindsight, this seems like a bizarre test of loyalty. The scientist given charge of this demand talked him down to a single platypus and shipped it off in a wooden crate. This is a telegram from Winston Churchill's advisor, letting him know that Australia's sending the platypus and perhaps he should put his cat somewhere outside. But when the ship was approaching England, it came into the range of a German submarine, and the captain detonated depth charges in response. The human crew was fine, but the platypus died of concussion. It's tricky to work with the material of the uncanny or weird without simply reinforcing this settler colonial exoticism, a fetishistic delight in otherness, or the equally acquisitive tendency to see ourselves as the lone saviors of dying species. Our emotional responses to living through the 6th extinction as its perpetrators are understandably complicated. One response to the loss of non-human life is mourning. In Australia, mourning the natural world as it's being destroyed sometimes seems to come at the expense of doing anything about its loss. Mourning tends to be a performance that reinforces and even naturalizes extinction. And this too has its roots in colonization. Patrick Brantlinger's 2003 book, Dark Vanishings, Discourse on the Extinction of Primitive Races, described the literary phenomenon of extinction discourse as a specific branch of the dual ideologies of imperialism and racism, which positions the death of colonized peoples as inevitable. Extinction narratives have been a part of upholding terra nullius from its beginnings. White settlers mourned the loss of Aboriginal people even as they stole from and murdered them. This phenomenon is starkest in Tasmanian literature, but it's everywhere in our storytelling. In this model, the story of tragedy, the emotional affect, doesn't absolve the perpetrators of violence, it enables them. And this function of extinction discourse also characterizes settler approaches to the non-human world. In mourning, nature is set against modernity. We revere the natural world with nostalgia. We're sorry to see it go, but really its time has come. In Australia, we have the highest rate of extinction in the OECD. 38% of mammalian extinctions worldwide have occurred here. The latest State of the Environment report tells a heartbreaking, horrifying story of habitat destruction and ecosystem collapse. But extinction is so normalized here that we often discount its significance. Sure, it's sad, but the show of productivity, development, and extraction must go on. In a recent illustration, Gold Coast theme park Dreamworld was given $2.7 million by the Queensland government to fund koala conservation, but was later allowed to spend the money on a roller coaster. I would edit that story out of my fiction. The satire is way too heavy-handed. So can we mourn the loss of nature without reinforcing these ideas, without speaking of natural loss as inevitable? Well, yes. Mourning is an important part of accepting the need to change. It's also a key arc of feeling which can motivate us to make change. The potential for mourning to fuel movements for justice is amply illustrated by social movements like ACT UP and the struggle against Black deaths in custody and Black Lives Matter. The mourning aesthetic really dominates Extinction Rebellion's protests as well, and I think that's why. Grief can lead us to realize the injustice of loss, to find solidarity and to take action. But writers who are settlers here need to ask ourselves, who is our mourning for? Are we mourning nature itself or the old configuration of a relationship from which we benefited? What can we learn from grief and what needs to change? In part, what we're losing is an idea of ourselves, a particular relationship, a hierarchy, a way of telling the story. So I think what we're seeing in the climate crisis is a huge and absolutely necessary shift in the way that we operate within nature, the way we conceive of the natural, the relationships that we're able to form with place. And of course, this reconfiguration is happening in fiction too, in literature. And it's comparable to the modernist transformation, which happened alongside the trauma of World War. The Anthropocene is perhaps an even more traumatic turn. So climate fiction for me is not a genre apart. It's already everywhere in our literature. Just as once unimaginable disasters are bleeding into our daily lives, we're increasingly seeing these uncanny or science fictional or dystopian elements bleeding into realist literature. Realism is having to expand very quickly to include reality. All fiction is Anthropocene fiction now. As James Ley wrote in a recent essay for the Sydney Review of Books, even the simplest human stories are implicated in catastrophic structural conditions. These days, even the pastoral is millenarian. Everyday conversations can end at the precipice of existential doubt and terror. Speaking to a stranger about the weather the other day, the conversation quickly moved to the flooding in Seoul, and my interlocutor concluded, everything's going haywire. We live, as historian Tom Griffiths has said, in uncanny times. Behind all of the manifestations of the eerie, writes Mark Fisher in The Weird and the Eerie, the central enigma at its core is the problem of agency. Fisher is writing about the way the birds in Daphne du Maurier's story, The Birds, on which Hitchcock's film was based, disturb readers' expectations of nature. What the birds threaten is the very structures of explanation that had previously made sense of the world. The agency of birds disturbs not only the human character's safety, but their sense of their place in the world, their whole logic of being, and ours as readers too. This idea of nature as an agentic, disturbing force has always been present in Australian writing, but it's taken various guises. There's the Gothic representations of nature as a haunting or reckoning with ghosts, colonization and illegitimate occupation, horror of nature as in Wake in Fright or Picnic at Hanging Rock, horror that is always mixed with kind of desire. There's a longing to draw spiritual sustenance from the land that comes through in Randolph Stowe's To the Islands or Patrick White's Voss. Or in Eve Langley's book, The Pea Pickers, where Langley's alter ego Steve directly conflates romanticism with extinction discourse thus. I raised a handful of the dust to my nostrils and smelt it. Ah, that aboriginal smell, we tread on the soft black dust of lost Gippsland tribes. Really quite a horrible moment in the book. But something is shifting now in these representations of the agentic landscape in fiction, in representations of the non-human. What I'm noticing is a much stronger awareness of entanglement, hybridity, and exchange. I see this in the work of writers like Evelyn Araluen, Robbie Arnott, James Bradley, Chrissy Neen, Laura Jean McKay, Jane Rawson, Ellen Van Neerven, Ben Walter, Alexis Wright. It's actually becoming quite a long list. And these shifts aren't happening in a linear fashion. All these forms of agentic nature reappear in Australian fiction in different eras and different guises and moods. But it's noticeable that in Australian fiction, in contemporary Anthropocene fiction, nature is often trying to disrupt the normal, trying to interrupt us and tell us something. Perhaps the uncanny is not a presence that should not be there, as Fisher proposed, but a presence that was always here and refuses to be forgotten or ignored. In Signs and Wonders, Delia Falconer observes that Australian writing about nature has always had a feral quality. I think it's partly because we are unsettled here. Whether as colonists or migrants or First Nations people, what we have in common is our displacement. We share a history that is interrupted and disordered, a series of broken transmissions, a process of estrangement. On Kaurna country, I'm a semi-naturalized Irish weed. And though we're making steps to regenerate or renegotiate or reclaim our connections with place, most of the time we're not sure how, or we're trying in spite of other forces, of ongoing destruction at a massive scale. So it's little wonder that a desire to unsettle ourselves is emergent in our fiction. Falconer also mentions that the climate crisis has made her suspicious of nature, suspicious of beauty itself, she says. As an unnatural being, this resonates on another level, since I've always been suspicious of nature. When I think with my queer imagination about nature in crisis, it's not necessarily conceived as a loss. That's because our relationship with the natural has needed a radical transformation for some time. We can't protect or care for the natural world using myths that enclose or devalue it. We can't protect or care for nature unless we're open to changing ourselves. The weird generates a kind of cognitive estrangement. The weird denaturalizes all worlds by exposing their instability, their openness to the outside, Mark Fisher writes, and I immediately think the weird offers an escape from what is into what could be. So the weird in literature is a kind of queer strategy in Sarah Ahmed's sense of queer use as a kind of repurposing. Queer uses, when things are used for purposes other than the ones for which they were intended, still reference the qualities of a thing. Queer uses may linger on those qualities, rendering them all the more lively. If the first thing any artist learns is attention to what is there, attention to nature, then what follows is the art of turning our attention to what is hidden, to the forces and intangible structures and disguises that operate beneath our worldviews, to foundational myths, sustaining narratives, and habitual ways of seeing. That is my material. I'm interested in writing that is attentive to what is missing, what's not there but should be, what's definitely there but goes habitually unseen. I'm interested in revelations and in ghosts. So the novel as a form is only about as old as capitalism, about 500 years, depending on who you ask. And in that time, the form has reinforced certain myths, certain habits of thought. It's helped us to see ourselves as protagonists, as isolated individuals on linear journeys through life. If, as Plumwood and Haraway have argued, we should aim to decenter the human, this means rethinking the idea of the novel as a linear journey and a single human story. It means breaking with the form. In Dyschronia, I tried to disrupt our expectations of linearity to draw attention to some of the temporal challenges of the climate crisis. In the airways, I was trying to rethink the borders, the boundaries between self and other. The ghost which possesses the novel, the fragmented multitude that shifts and morphs and breathes through the book, was an interesting proposition, at once frightening and desirable, a way of writing about transcending our limitations. The ghost's capacity to move outward from the self through shared breath, shared atmosphere, gave me a tool for examining the power dynamics of boundaries and borders and what happens to us when they break down. Excuse me. The ghost is an unnatural being. The ghost goes against nature in the most fundamental way. They cheat death. But there's also an element of fantasy in leaving the body behind, the body with its pesky gender presentations and problems of visibility, and being able to possess or inhabit or interfere with other bodies. Maybe the ghost is the kind of unnatural being that allows us to see past the terms of our own lives, to see ourselves on another scale. Ghosts might allow us to witness other ways of being, or give us insight into our complex and deeply troubled relationships with lives beyond our own. The coronavirus pandemic has, of course, made all these concerns about shared breath and shared atmosphere more urgent and visible in daily life. As I was editing the book in an apartment in northern Italy, sirens were sounding all around me. Death was everywhere. There was suddenly visible evidence of our shared microbiome, our shared immune system, shared vulnerability. I was more aware than ever of the startling fact that we all live together in a single fragile bubble of atmosphere. I even dared to hope that this virus would become transformative, that we would take from it a lesson in our interdependence and kinship with all life, that maybe it would help to save us. Around 8% of human DNA is made up of viruses. To be specific, endogenous retroviruses, which alter the DNA in ways that are passed on to offspring. Some scientists say that this 8% figure is an understatement. When you factor in the 45% of the human genome that is made up of pre-viral transpose elements, it turns out that we're not very much ourselves at all. These elements used to be thought of as junk DNA, but it turns out they're essential to evolution. Viruses help us mutate. Viruses might be what made us human. Maybe I'm just trying to make meaning out of grief, but there's something powerful in that uncanny intimacy. And queer ecology can bear witness to these kinds of intimacy and work to reveal our permeability, blur the boundaries between self and other, human and non-human, life and non-life. These ideas I'm sharing on queer natures and writing about the climate crisis are far from comprehensive. There's a lot going on, particularly in terms of the politics of writing about nature from a settler position, the responsibilities of queer ecology to work alongside decolonization, the impossibility of writing simultaneously for and against nature as an unnatural being who is also very much part of nature. Negative capability is an important part of queer strategy. It sometimes means allowing yourself to be unreasonable, allowing the text to make no sense, accepting indeterminacy and doubt. The need for negative capability extends into the relationship between theory and practice. The natural world itself has a more profound influence on my work than I can easily express in language. It's much deeper than my capacity to intellectualize it. I understand that stories come from places. All my work, my very being, is connected to the landscapes where I've lived and breathed. The imagination is called forth, but the imagination is bigger than I am, the work of it much longer than my lifetime. And the agency of the natural world is not a literary conceit for me to play with, it's an experienced truth. Maybe nature's not a place, but I still love to go there. The natural world has always provided solace. Being in nature is a respite from labor and from society. It recharges my batteries. It's not a backdrop to imaginative work, but its strongest source. Time spent in nature is often fugitive, hours or days taken back from working life or public visibility. And it changes the way I experience time. It changes the way I pay attention. The mind is allowed to relax, become diffuse, unfocused, but it's also open and receptive, aware of detail in a different way. When I'm walking, I stop and look constantly at the twists of coastal trees, what they tell you about wind and light, or the rare sharp plants that live in dune environments protected by the difficulty of their conditions, what they tell you about survival. I watch an echidna flex their armor, nose in the soft soil of their meal. All of this restores the soul and salves the pain of loss. It re-engages me with the world. Queer nature can flourish in marginal places. I can feel connected to nature in a city park or a ruined building or a weed-strewn yard. I can walk around the corner from my house and touch the trunk of the enormous lemon-scented gum outside the cleaning chemical factory and feel its strength for a moment against my hand, like that of an enormous horse. The tree is not there for me. It's not mine. I can't measure its worth. When I'm stuck or running out of energy, I walk. Sometimes it's a multi-day hike, and sometimes it's just a stroll around my neighborhood, past the factories and townhouse renovations, the warehouses and gyms, down to the river, Garawirapari. At my desk, I might think about narrative structure, deadlines, or my finances, but in nature, I can remember other kinds of order, forms of cohabitation and organization that I might not otherwise encounter. There's a flourishing of creativity and diversity in the exchanges of weeds and native species, a messy disharmony in the sounds of birds and frogs and people together, a feeling of being with other beings, of belonging to something greater than yourself. Marginal places resist human order and commodification. I've always disliked the idea that fiction's purpose is to build empathy between people. It's a worthy goal, I suppose, but it just seems so lacking in ambition, because fiction can go so much further. It can help us to dissolve the borders between self and other, human and non-human, can help us to reshape ourselves and our ways of living together, to think our way past the limitations of our culture. There's a similar kind of moral instrumentalism in many of our discussions about nature, like trees are good for our mental health or time outdoors has positive educational outcomes. Worthy, but so limited in the way they position the natural world in the service of social order. The myth of domination endures. Uncanny work that seeks to haunt or disturb or unsettle is writing that acts in opposition to the myths that might comfort, reassure, and calm us. I want to read literature that concerns itself with the entanglements and estrangements inherent in our relationships with nature, including the unnatural. Writing that allows for mystery and indeterminacy. I'm encouraged by the many transgressions and hybridities and transformations now emerging in this country's stories, and I see all of them as part of a bigger project to expand the imagination. I don't work with weirdness or the uncanny for the sake of titillation, but in the service of possibility, because I think it can help us to make our way out of the mess we found ourselves in. Beyond conservation, beyond the necessary operations of salvage and restoration and mourning, decolonization and reparation and justice, there is also mutation, diversification, collaboration, interdependence, reciprocity. And these aren't new ideas. Politically, they're at least as old as the human presence on this continent, and all of them are processes in nature. So I hesitate to use terms like post-natural or post-human. The obsession with novelty is, I think, part of the problem, the way we so often confuse creativity with innovation. It's important to know that some of this work is memory work, remembering that the tendency of the natural world is to flourish and mutate and multiply and diversify. And it's only our interpretations, our value systems that have been preventing us from seeing those processes as natural. But you don't have to reinvent the universe, just learn to look at it sideways. The river, Garawirapari, still gives this place its shape. Adelaide's west used to flood every year. Feels like it might flood again tonight. Where I live, there were grasslands and sedges. Now it's semi-industrial. The river's course has been changed and manipulated, its banks built up, but its power endures. There are always people walking there or standing near the water. Once I came across someone singing to it. And writing about nature can be that simple too. A way of returning to a place you love and offering it your song. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. It was just brilliant. Oh, the brain's visiting. It was just fabulous listening to wide-ranging discussion across so many different topics, and the stories about the animals. Oh goodness, the poor platypus with concussion. I was very quite distressed about that. And these ideas about intimacy and distance and unsettling our conventional ideas of nature, which is brilliant. Thank you. We have some time for questions. There is a mic going around in case anyone would like to ask Jen anything about her talk. Or do we need a little bit of processing time? I had a question to start off with. Talk about idea of I noticed when reading this. The other thing that made me think of would have said but it's kind of like those senses. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I'll just repeat that. I was just talking about the idea of the senses for the people in the ether who didn't hear me just then, and how there are senses like sound and smell that bring the natural world to us far more closely than the sense of than our eyes, the sense of sight. And in Dyschronia, Jen has a description of the cuttlefish on the beach, and the smell of those decaying bodies is so powerful that she describes it as an assault. So I'm just wondering if the use of those senses in our writing or in our literature is a way of bringing the natural world in rather than sight. And if we can do that more easily in writing than we might be able to do in other forms. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, sorry, it feels odd to speak to you through the microphone, but one thing I noticed when I was writing this talk was how much I was using sight as a metaphor of like how we need to change the way we see ourselves and how visually dominated the language is, but actually our experience of the world is multisensory. And I think that's one thing that literature can definitely work with because it's I feel like the text can invade the body in a way that you can sort of put yourself in the position, like your imagination uses all of your senses, right? And so I'm very conscious in my writing of using all of my senses and even like a sixth sense sometimes. Really interesting thing about the 19th century obsession with ghosts is that it coincides with like gas lighting being really popularized, and there's theories that actually it was mild brain damage that was causing people to have all of these little visions of light and uncanny experiences. So yeah, I'm not sure how true that is, but it's a theory that I've read. So who knows what the PFAS chemicals are doing to our brains.
Hi. This is not exactly a question, but I was really interested in what you said at the end about how people can confuse innovation and creativity. And I just wondered if you had anything else to say about that. I thought it was really interesting.
Yeah. So part of that is, I think, politically right now where we're at is in a place where we have this sort of like creative industries mentality around art making, and that you're supposed to be this very sort of innovative, making new stuff all the time. And it's a very sort of productivity expansion mentality. And I think art actually has the potential to work in more of a sustainable degrowth economy. So there is a relationship between valuing the arts and valuing the natural world and stopping destroying it. But we need to rearrange our entire economy outside of growth. So it's complicated. But I think when you look at the way that kind of creativity operates, it's not always new. Like the imagination isn't always thinking up new things. It's making different combinations of things. And that's why everybody's gifted and everybody's different, because your perspective, you're at the node of all of these intersections of interests and curiosities and ideas. And so everybody's got a unique perspective. Whereas, you know, the old idea of like the lone genius is always a white man having these ideas like out of nothing, out of divine inspiration. It's just bollocks to me. That's not how it works.
Hello. I'm just interested in what you were saying about natural places, unnatural places, things being displaced, and who decides, the power structures behind, what is a natural place and what is an unnatural place. I'm just wondering how, literature can help people understand, these issues.
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's definitely a tension in between like queer ecology's appreciation for sort of marginal spaces and conservation's approach to, or like, public planning's approach to green spaces or wild spaces, and how we sort of manage and organize that stuff. And I think that when I think about this problem, I think about play and the way that children behave in spaces. And often you will see kids running amok in places that are not designed for them, like an empty lot, or they'll create a skate park or create something out of nothing. Whereas if you put a very orderly, organized play structure in a space, they won't necessarily gravitate towards it. And so I think, yeah, maybe there's a ways that literature can help us to value spaces that aren't just constructed for us, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi. I'm really interested in the idea of entanglement and kind of getting messy with nature that you were talking about. And I'm just wondering, like, how do we do that in everyday life? Do you have any ideas on that?
Yeah, I guess there's lots of ways, and small things like gardening or looking after a patch of earth or cleaning up the beach when you're on the beach, or just walking. But also I think being aware of provenance is really important, and being aware of where things come from and like the resources that you use and the air that you breathe and the things that you're eating. like you're already entangled with nature because you're eating food and breathing air. Like it's not a thing that you have to manufacture in your life because it's already part of why you're alive. But I guess just promoting an awareness of that interdependence is important to me. And I think I probably do it through like really basic stuff like food and gardening and walking. Oh, that's nice.
Can I first just say what a wonderful presentation, because it has been taking me some processing time to even, and that is one of the best photos I've ever seen. But what I was wanting to ask about is this idea of diversity and opening up the space for diverse perspectives to help us, you know, I suppose to have a symbiotic appreciation of the diversity in nature, but then also the diversity of perspectives that we need to embrace to get to new solutions. And I'm really thinking about this from my own perspective as a journalist, because we got stuck in this binary of is climate change real or not for far too long. And so I guess I'm asking what would you say to people who want to try and find diverse ways of speaking, and especially students? Like, how would you approach like young people who are struggling to find their voice? Sorry, that's a really long question.
Yeah, so the thing about diversity is that it's often framed in writing and journalism as like, we just need to be more inclusive, and it's quite tokenistic, and it's a way of sort of adding value or decorating the white supremacist voice. And so sometimes what white writers need to do is just shut up and make space for other people. And what I would say to young writers is ask for help, especially young writers of color, queer writers, emerging writers. Learn to ask for help because people will help you. And I think that is a really key skill in also learning your sort of interdependency in an ecosystem of literature. Like none of us are in this on our own. We're all in this like project together of staying alive and thinking our way through it. And we have to start acting like it and stop acting like we're in competition with each other all the time.
About that term unnatural disasters, which I think is a great term, but I wonder if it's not actually unnatural because certain segments of the population deserve what's coming. And I've just finished an essay on Andrew McGann's The Rich Man's House, which is about nature taking revenge on a man who wanted to climb the highest fictional mountain in the world. It was almost twice the size of Mount Everest. And it was a book about hubris and nemesis. And nature was taking revenge on this man for thinking that he could conquer nature. And in a sense, what we're doing with generating the climate, the greenhouse gases and everything else, and the pulling down all the trees and the deforestation, all those activities, generating a response that is entirely natural. But I really like the idea you've come up with. That idea that you put forth of
yeah, I guess it's kind of a provocation, and I wish that the retributive justice, natural justice that you're speaking of was going to happen the way that we want it to happen, but it's not going to happen that way. It's going to happen the other way. Rich guys are going to space. The rest of us are stuck here. The poor people drown first. We all know that's what's going to happen. The rich people have known this is what's going to happen since the 1970s at the very least, and they've committed to it. So like, if we want their houses to be destroyed, we're going to have to be doing that ourselves. Yeah.
Okay, one more. You've talked a lot about the unnatural. I was just wondering, well, how would you define the unnatural?
I deliberately wouldn't. It was really, I'm being cheeky because there's not really anything in nature that's either natural or unnatural. Or like these are human concepts, and like I'm obviously not really an alien just because I've been described as unnatural by the Catholic Church. But you know, I guess yeah, broadening our concepts of nature. And maybe observation is really important here as well, because I think we can sort of fall into these sort of patterns of binary definitions. And actually, if you go and look at a little patch of the earth for 15 minutes and watch what's really happening, and there's a lot of processes going on. Some of them are really weird.
Thank you very much for this presentation. So many fascinating things to unpick here. But one thing that I was thinking about was, I know that you mentioned some Australian writers who are sort of like dealing with different elements of the uncanny and stuff, and also evolving the Australian Gothic, which is really cool. And then you also spoke about turning your attention to what is hidden. And one of those things were the foundational myths that we have in our culture. What I'm really fascinated by and questioning, I guess, for myself is, Jen, do you have any thoughts on like who were the writers who are making new foundational myths? You know, like there's sort of talk these days with Donna Haraway and stuff of like speculative fiction, imagining what could be and stuff. Like, do you know of any Australian writers, you know, who are sort of writing in that space? Maybe you're one of them, actually. I don't know, but yeah.
Yeah, so I think Alexis Wright is probably my favorite writer working in this space in terms of like rewriting the whole story of what Australia is. But apart from the writers that I mentioned, I think there's also like really interesting crop of young writers coming up, and there are a couple of anthologies out recently of First Nations and speculative fiction kind of writers. So check those out. One of them's edited by Michaela Clements and the other one I can't remember. I'd written that down. Yeah, there's two anthologies that are out at the moment. Got one on my bedside table and I can't remember the name of it. Yes, yeah. Yeah, you will come back now.
Lovely to have you here. When we finished the last series with the poets, a couple of audience members bolted out and purchased some books of poetry. So if you feel similarly inspired by Jen's words, please do look at her work, her fiction and her non-fiction. It's a great way of supporting writers, and we need all the help we can get in these difficult times. Thank you to Amber for your wonderful translating, especially as you were solo tonight and your brain must need a break soon. And just a heads up that our next talk will be by Jane Rawson. She's coming from Lutruwita in Tassie, and she will be at the Museum of Design at 5:30 p.m. on the 14th of September. So check the CP3 website for the Thank you everyone for coming.
Thanks, Jess. Thanks, Amber.